Hello, this is Erica Bender-Wooten, the Senior Program Officer at the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. This webinar is part of the Foundation's Health for a Change training series. This free series is comprised of webinars and in-person workshops designed to support the efforts of Kentucky's community health coalitions, agencies, health advocates, and other interested community members. I'd like to begin today's webinar with a brief introduction to the Foundation. The Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky was founded in 2001 with a mission to address the unmet healthcare needs of Kentuckians. The Foundation currently has two main focus areas: promoting responsive health policy, which aims to make public policy more responsive to the health and healthcare needs of the people of Kentucky, and investing in Kentucky's future, which aims to improve the health of Kentucky's children by engaging communities in testing innovative strategies. The Foundation fulfills its mission through a variety of activities, which include grant making, supporting targeted research, convening key stakeholders, providing policymakers with information needed to make decisions which impact the health of Kentuckians, and by offering training and technical assistance through events like this one. Next, I want to direct you to the Foundation's website, healthy-ky.org. There you will find archives of past Health for a Change webinars, Foundation reports, and issue briefs, and an upcoming event schedule. Today we'll hear from Parrish Ravelli and Yana Parikh with Youth Empowered Solutions. They have a great presentation planned for you. All participant lines are muted, but you may submit questions via the chat feature at any time. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A session in the middle and at the end of the presentation. The slides and a recorded version and a recording of the webinar will be available on our website within a few days. You will receive an email notifying you when they're available. Before I turn things over, I'd like to provide you with a brief introduction. Yana is from Raleigh, North Carolina, and she is currently a sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill, majoring in psychology. In high school, she worked on Access to Healthcare team at YES and remains connected to the YES program. Parrish Ravelli, a 2003 graduate of St. Andrews Presbyterian College, became involved in community organizing work in 2004 while serving as an AmeriCorps Vista with the Montana Prevention Resource Center. Since 2006, Parrish has been working in the field of youth empowerment in a variety of settings: tobacco use prevention, municipalities and youth councils, access to care, and oral health equity. Welcome, Parrish and Yana. We're honored to have you join us today.
Thanks, Erica. And thanks so much for the introduction. Yana and I are both really excited to be here talking with some new people, some new partners about the work that we do. I'm going to real quick let Jana say hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jana.
All right, we're going to dig in. Youth Empowered Solutions, we're a national nonprofit based out of offices in Asheville, Charlotte, and Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm excited to be here to talk about the YES Youth Empowerment Model, about leveraging the capacity of youth to create lasting change in your communities. As an organization and as an individuals, John and I love these types of conversations. We love talking with new partners. We're excited about expanding the capacity and the role of youth in their communities and working more deeply with the youth that they engage. Within our slides, here's what we're hoping to accomplish. We want to explore millennials as a generation and even think about our own generational characteristics. We want to provide a brief overview on the theory of and research on youth empowerment. We'll highlight some strategies for effectively recruiting and retaining young people. And finally, we'll share information about the YES Youth Empowerment Model and how we measure both impact and outcomes. There's going to be a number of resources that we will send out following the webinar to help you continue in your work to engage young people. And I also want to let you know that we at YES would love to continue the conversation outside of this webinar. So if there are opportunities to follow up, please be sure to check us out at www.youthempoweredsolutions.org or email me at parrish@youthempoweredsolutions.org. As we move through the slides today, there's two questions that we want you to think about. In what ways do you, as adults, represent the voice of youth within the work that your organization does? And what opportunities exist for youth to represent themselves within the work that your organization does? We ask these questions because we think that youth empowerment is built on a working partnership between youth and adults. It's not taking all of the power away from adults and giving it to youth, but rather it's a balance, and for that balance to exist, youth must be present. Real quick, I want to do an introduction of our organization and dig a little bit deeper into who YES is, because I think it will provide some context. This is our YES team. We have roughly 30 employees, 1/3 of which are adult staff, and the rest are high school-aged youth. We work to empower these youth and other youth that we train in partnership with adults to create community change. The most important part of the mission statement for me, I think, is the last piece. Creating community change, because there's such a broad spectrum of quote-unquote youth work in the world that we live in, and we're intentional in saying that we do not focus on individual behavior change at YES. For us, it's imperative for a youth empowerment strategy to have a focus on creating larger structural changes in communities that then trickle down and impact larger populations of people. So some of the ways that YES does this. At our work, we facilitate a combination of direct advocacy work and training/consulting. With the youth staff that we hire and partner with, we engage in strategic advocacy work in communities and in states that we all live in. In all of our advocacy work, we focus on changing systems, environments, and/or policies, and we'll talk more about that later. We know that through empowering youth as advocates, those individual youth will develop, but they will be changing the landscape for other youth who aren't directly involved. That higher level change is what we invest our time in at YES. Outside of the advocacy work we do, our youth and adult staff do a great deal of training and consulting for other organizations that want to implement a youth empowerment framework within their organization. We provide adult trainings for adults to be able to apply the youth empowerment model, and our youth train other youth to critically understand issues and to develop their abilities to be able to advocate for sustainable change. The great success that we typically see is when we have had a chance to work with adults and organizations to partner on building a platform that supports youth empowerment, and then have our youth staff train youth connected to those partners and activating them around creating community change. On top of trainings, though, we do a lot of coaching and consulting with organizations who just want to think through how, within their infrastructure, they can better include youth as stakeholders. And so right now, yes, we spend the majority of our time working in a few specific adolescent health areas. And so this is to say, when we are doing direct advocacy work and when we are training other groups to do direct advocacy work, the majority of the time it relates to one of these four areas: real food and active living, which is our obesity prevention work, tobacco use prevention, substance abuse prevention, and access to care, which also has a spectrum that works around oral health equity. However, I want to point out that while we have years of experience working in these fields and creating systemic change in these fields, we're intentional about saying that we are not experts in these areas. Our experience and our expertise really is grounded in youth empowerment, which for us just plays out in these different focus areas. So real quick, let's talk about what youth and adult partnerships are. On the screen, you can see how Youth Empowered Solutions defines youth-adult partnerships. It's a partnership based on an understanding of the mutually beneficial nature of interaction whereby both youth and adults have something different yet equally valuable to share with one another. I think that one of the things that I like to lift up most about this idea is that point of value. Last week I was observing a couple of youth present to the board of directors at their organization. I heard one of them talk about how they thought that the adults typically think that youth are too immature to serve on a board of directors. This really hit home to me because I think that the level of maturity is not really the point of value for young people being engaged at such a level. While the level of maturity may impact how information is delivered and it may impact how information is received, I think that the point of value is that the perspective of young people is absent and needs to be present in the issues that they're trying to impact. And this is something that we as adults cannot access and something that cannot be taken away from young people. And so the point of value is just the presence and the participation, the meaningful participation of young people in the given situation. But let's first take a step back and figure out who we're even talking about when we say youth. And I'm going to turn it over to Jana right now to talk about some of the generational aspects that we know about young people today.
So when we consider who youth are, a major part of that cohort are millennials, and so these are people born between 1981 and 1993. And these people are characterized by different qualities than preceding generations. For example, millennials are extremely diverse and often tend to be confident in a way that can be pretty close to entitlement. Along with certain qualities, millennials also have experiences that are vastly different from prior generations. The 9/11 attacks and ensuing war on terror are defining moments in their lives, as well as the explosion of the internet, cell phones, and social media. Most millennials remember a time before these events, but also have adapted to incorporate these events into their current worldview. They can remember the advances made with computers and cell phones, but they are usually also very proficient with new technology. So I think that this list is really interesting because it really highlights some of those ways that millennials have adapted defining moments in their lives into their current worldview. I'll just give you a minute or so to read through this list. And I'd also like to challenge you to think of any major world events that have occurred in your lifetime or as you were growing up. And if you feel comfortable sharing them, then put them in the chat box for us to look at. And something else that I think, or something else that has been a huge topic of discussion lately is that with current generations, the increased access and presence of the internet and social media that I was talking about also means that it's a lot harder to look at single events and apply them to the whole generation. And so the ability to receive information quickly and constantly makes it very difficult to pinpoint a defining moment for an entire generation, as we are now so used to constantly getting updates and hearing about new developments. And so this kind of brings me to what's next in Gen Z. And so Gen Z is the upcoming generation and includes people born between 1996 and 2009. This generation is really interesting because they have some similarities with millennials, but there are also some really profound differences, specifically with what I was talking about in terms of finding events that define a whole generation. For example, I was born in 1996, and I clearly remember what happened on September 11th, but anyone born in 1998 or later will have no recollection of the attacks. And so to them, things like TSA and the war on terror have just kind of always existed. This generation is also extremely connected to each other, to the media, to the world at large, etc. To people in Gen Z, information is constantly available and constantly updated and constantly changing. So it's very easy for them to be critically aware to the other people in their community and to the world at large.
So why do we go through that information? We do that a lot, and it is built into a number of our adult leader trainings, particularly those that focus on recruitment and retainment, how to effectively recruit and retain youth within the work that you're doing. I think it's important to go through that information, well, for a number of reasons. We think most importantly is that you have to really know who your audience is if you're going to effectively recruit them, but also if you're going to effectively work with them. Having a sound grip on how and why millennials and Gen Z can operate can be critical to your success. It might even impact the first point of contact that you have with the youth that you are trying to work with. You know, I used to say, quote, "You used to recruit youth at the community center, and now you need to be recruiting on Facebook." But I think now a more appropriate saying is, and from what I've learned, you need to be recruiting on Instagram, and you need to be recruiting at the community center. And as a side note, steer clear of Facebook. It's really only for adults. And I want to tell you that for those of you who have struggled with recruitment issues, I feel your pain. I have been there. But I also want to say there is no single solution. You know, there is no place where everyone else recruits youth from that you haven't been told about. There is no secret health fair that you haven't been invited to. What makes both recruiting and retaining youth effective, more than anything, is how you are meeting the youth where they are at, both physically and within the existing power dynamics. If you are intending on sharing power with youth that you want to work with, you can start by getting out of the world that we as adults live in and get into the world that youth live in. Well, this can be done in a number of ways. One process that we like to point to, yes, that's been really effective for us for a number of years, we call it the recruitment filter. On the surface, it looks just like setting up a lunchroom table in a high school with a sign-up sheet. I'm sure everybody can be familiar with a situation like that. But when you start to examine some of the intentional details that are built into this process, you can see that even something as small as getting out from behind the table, going to the students and sitting down at their table with them and talking with them is going to totally change the entire recruitment experience. It also might cause a few high school flashbacks for any adults willing to do it, and this is a testament to my own experiences. So, to those brave few who have had the courage to venture out into your high school cafeteria, I'm totally available for consoling afterwards. But I'm not going to dive too deep into the specifics of the recruitment filter because we have written it up in a great, what we call, blueprint. And after this webinar, I'm going to send it out, and hopefully you can start to look at some of those details and adopt some of them in your recruitment methods. But I do want to make sure that I spend some time talking about a bit of a logistical tip towards recruiting, something that we see often in our work at YES. So often when organizations who are recruiting youth, that the process for bringing youth on doesn't always match the expectations that they have when the youth are engaged. And one tangible way that this plays out that we have seen a ton is a lot of organizations use an application or a form as a part of the process to recruit youth. Now, I want to say I'm a fan of this process. I think that applications are great. I think that they can create a filter so that the right youth come to the table. I also think that it helps to set a level of prestige to the opportunity, and I think that it adds value to the experience. However, I often see youth applications that ask questions and ask for information that are fairly unrelated to the actual work that they're going to be doing. They ask things like, or they ask those "what do you think" questions. Questions like, what do you think a leader is? Or What do you think the problems in your community are? While I think that that information is important, I think that you can get the answers to those questions later. But in the meantime, I think that it builds an ambiguity in what the expectations are going to be for getting work done. And that then leads to unfulfilled expectations, either on the end of the adults or the youth, but ultimately leads to turnover. What helps retain youth, and really people in general, is having clarity and transparency about the expectations. And you can start by doing that in the application and recruiting process. What if you ask questions like, tell me how you would go about getting another youth to eat healthy food options, or how would you convince an elected official to build a farmer's market in a food desert? Here you're not necessarily looking for the right answer, but you are framing up some of the work so that if this person comes on, they already have some context and have a little more clarity around what the expectations are going to be. So and I'm actually going to turn it over to Jana real quick. And after Jana talks, we'll do some Q&A and take a real quick break and see if there are any questions just on what we've talked about so far. If not, we'll move forward. If so, we'll answer them. But I'm going to ask Jana just to share her experience around being recruited to Youth Empowered Solutions.
Yeah, so there are really three things that I want to highlight about my recruitment process. And the first thing is that when I was approached with the opportunity, it was from a friend of mine who's also a young person. And so that was really important to me because, hearing him talk about it and hearing his experience, really made it seem like he enjoyed the work, he felt the work was meaningful, he felt valued, and it was more than just like a surface level job that he was doing. And so hearing that from somebody who was my peer, who I could relate to, really helped me kind of understand the work, and it really, made me want to do this kind of work as well. So the second part was we did an application, but part of the application was also some logistic questions. So things like, do you have transportation? Will you be able to provide your own transportation to the office? Will you be able to give a year-long commitment and things like that? And so for me, that really helped set up the expectations that I had, as well as the expectations that other, the adult partners would have about more logistical things and about, kind of doing the work. And so it also held me accountable as an employee, because if I put that I was going to be able to provide my own transportation, if I wasn't able to do that, I was accountable for my own actions. So it gave me a little bit of responsibility and accountability and some power in that situation as well. And so the final part of the recruitment process was the interview. And I remember very clearly that we were asked to come up with an activity to help teach other young people about a health issue, which, in hindsight, I can see how that relates to the work that we do at YES. But when I was going through the interview process, it seemed a little bit, it wasn't necessarily what I expected for a job interview. But, again, in hindsight, because it relates so much to the work that we do at YES and the trainings and, the peer-to-peer communication, it really, set up expectations in my mind about the kind of work that I would be doing at YES. And it also set up expectations in the adult partners' minds about what I could bring to the table, what my strengths and weaknesses were as they related specifically to the work that we were doing. So I think that the whole, recruitment process gave me a really clear understanding of what was expected of me, the kind of work that I would be doing, and why, why it was important and why I might enjoy it. And it also gave the adults a clear understanding of my abilities, what I would bring to the table, and things like that.
Great, thanks, Jana. So we are going to just pick our heads up for a minute. So we're sort of in the middle here, and are there any questions about anything that we have discussed so far?
Parrish, this is Erica. I have one question. How do you have any suggestions for working with a group that is constantly changing? And I'm not sure if you'll get to that later on in your presentation, but in recruitment, a lot of times effort is put into recruiting youth to come and to participate, and then you don't see those same kids over a period of time. So do you have any suggestions in working with kids when the group's constantly changing?
Yeah, so I think that for starters, there is an underlying reality that working with young people, there is always going to be some form of natural turnover because they get older and they become adults. So I think that to some extent it's to be expected. However, I would say that for really targeted work, focusing on and planning for a decent-sized commitment, a long-term commitment, is going to be the best strategy. And I think in order to get that, you have to find ways to provide value to those youth for the value that they are bringing to your program or your organization. I think it is a reality that we pay our youth at Yes. That is not a recruitment tool. It is because we want to provide value because we can't do our work without youth. And so we need to value what they bring to the table. And so I think that, and it is relative to where you are as an organization and with your financial capacity. And I will also say that success is not dependent on money. The one thing that we hear over and over again with our youth staff is that they would continue doing the work without the paycheck. But we as an organization feel like we need, that is our method of providing a value to what they bring to the table. And so think of some different ways, and I think really a great place to start is have a conversation with their youth about how you can provide them something that helps to meet their needs, that shows them value, since they are providing value to what you're doing.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we have another question in the chat. Have agencies changed their application process based on your recommendations, and do you have a sample application to share?
Yes and yes, absolutely. We have done workshops where we've had adults bring their youth applications to the table, and we actually do this side-by-side comparison, and we start by, we'll get a big flip chart piece of paper, and we'll list out, tell us everything that you want to work with youth to do, and describe the activities, the nuts and the bolts. And we'll do that first, and then we'll pull out the applications and we'll say, let's look at all of your questions and how many of them directly correlate with the activities that you want to do. And then we start making decisions about what does correlate and we want to keep it, what does not correlate and we want to get rid of it, or are there things that don't correlate but we still want to keep it. So, and through that exercise, I think that that anybody can do on their own. I think that it can really illuminate the clarity of expectations that you are laying down as you bring young people in. And yes, there's to the second question, we do have a sample application. We actually have what we call a youth HR toolkit that has a number of logistical pieces, job descriptions, consent forms, the job application, things that partners can use, and I can make sure to share that with Erica, who can pass it along following the webinar. So it looks like there's another question. Recruiting youth without lived experience. I am going to need a little more clarity on what lived experience is. But I do want to make sure, I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So Kathy, we'll make sure to get back to you first because we're going to do another round of Q&A at the end of our slides. So hold on to the question, and then we'll make sure we bump that up when we get through. So I'm going to keep going. And we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about empowerment theory and some particular research. But one of the things that we have found over the past 5 to 10 years is that in regards to research on youth work and youth programming, there isn't a lot of research related to youth empowerment. But Mark Zimmerman is one of the foremost published authors and leaders on empowerment theory, and one that we look to for published evidence of youth empowerment. And Mark says that empowerment theory connects individual well-being with the larger social and political environment and suggests that people need opportunities to become active in community decision-making in order to improve their lives, organizations, and communities. This tells us, for example, that it is just as important for someone to practice good oral hygiene as an individual as it is for them to be engaged in understanding the policies and the systems that surround the oral health care system and what disparities exist and what opportunities are there to engage decision makers and their legislators to address some of those disparities. Because of this, in order to effectively organize and empower youth, it's necessary to utilize a framework that allows for comprehending, challenging, engaging, and owning the role that youth have within the context of the larger community. I also share, in regards to research, I think folks received an executive summary of a white paper that YES put together a short while ago. And this was in part, we put this together in part due to the lack of research. And what we did was consolidate what research we could pull together. And it's in part because there's a distinct gap between academic researchers and people on the ground doing the work, which you most likely know. And so we wanted to consolidate this research and then to synthesize it with information that we have related on applying the youth empowerment framework, and so that we can kind of get a bit of a soup to nuts example of here's what research says, here's how it plays out within an organization, and here are ideas for evaluating and measuring success. After the call, in addition to some of the other resources, I will send up a full white paper who's interested, but it can also, this is one of the resources that can also be found on our website, again, youthempoweredsolutions.org. So one last resource that I'll send out afterwards is a less traditional version of research, and it's something that we call Change Chronicles, and this is our way of more succinctly capturing the process of empowering youth to create change. We created these short 2-page articles that lift up the problem, the obstacles, and how they were overcome to create outcomes. We hope that these Change Chronicles tell the story in a way that partners can visualize them and frame a youth empowerment lens within their own work. There's specific stories told through the lens of the youth empowerment model, which is coming up next. But again, I'm also going to send this out afterwards. And one last thing before we dive into the youth empowerment model, I want to lift up that youth empowerment is not a program, it is not an arm of an organization. Youth empowerment entails a culture shift in how you do business. Youth empowerment is both a process in how you are empowering youth and are continually operating, as well as the result of operating in that particular way. This is both a destination and how you get there. And collectively, you know, it is no easy task and takes considerable intention and investment. But I also really want to testify that it comes with a significant return. If you are empowering youth, then it is as inherent in your organization as is your fund development or your financial management. So let's look at the youth empowerment model. This is what's on the screen, and this is really the cohesion of three core components: skill development, critical awareness, and opportunities. It is a model that is visually very simple, but in application is very dynamic. This is the model that we help organizations to apply within their community advocacy work. It is the model that we apply within all of our work, and how it is our system of evaluation and checks and balances. But let's look at each of the three components. And in doing so, think about how each of them correlates with developing the capacity of youth to change systems, environments, and policies. So when we talk about skill development, it's important to think about what skills go into creating change. Public speaking, analyzing data, negotiating, even time management. A lot of times these skills that youth need to equitably participate in this work are pretty supplemental to what they're gaining in traditional school settings. They're also very complementary. We all know that if policies and systems were easy to change just by simply asking, then we wouldn't need to change them. And so what goes into changing a policy? How are you making your case? Does it require developing an action plan, surveying the community, or surveying an environment? What about mapping data to identify key disparate geographies? As an adult, it's our role to provide the tools and the platforms for these skills to be honed. A big part of the skill development component is practicing and debriefing, which starts to trickle into the second component, which is critical awareness. And this is essentially lifting up the deeper root causes of community issues. Critical awareness means not just understanding an issue, but why it exists, what policies and systems enable it to exist, who supports those policies, who doesn't, and why. This is a component that dives wholeheartedly into the equity within this work. To build critical awareness means to talk about the intersection of things like age and race and ethnicity, gender, to draw correlations about how systems benefit some and not others. Similarly, developing a critical awareness includes understanding decision-making and political systems and how they operate. This is how effective strategies are built and how resiliency is developed. As we all know, this type of work is so often a matter of playing the long game. As adults, it's our role to ask questions that have no easy answers and to step back and allow for thoughts to be processed. The best way to stifle a deeper understanding and ownership of an opinion is really just to simply answer someone's question. So the last piece, we have opportunities. And since we've talked about investing in and equipping young people to have the capacity to engage at a deeper level, we need to make sure that opportunities exist to authentically participate as stakeholders. As an individual, how are youth leading groups of their peers? Within your organization, what roles are there for youth to play in decision making? Maybe on a board, maybe as staff, maybe within your organizational policies. And within the community, are youth visible and engaged in decision-making processes that ultimately impact them the most? Are they lifted up in the media? Do they serve or even regularly present to your community boards? As adults, it's our role to ensure that young people have the capacity to access these opportunities and that these opportunities are protected and secure. Then it's our responsibility to step back and turn over the power to young people, who, in many times, have the greatest stake in this work at all. So one last thing I want to point out about this model, when applying it, the three components, skill development, critical awareness, and opportunities, are not sequential. They're fluid, and each component should be in existence at all times. And many times, skill development overlaps a lot with critical awareness. If a young person is surveying parents to gather feedback on an issue, they're both practicing a skill and getting a deeper understanding of the issue they're talking about. In this example, it's our role as an adult to ask the questions, to debrief, and to spark a deeper level of thought about the work that they are doing.
So when we talk about social justice and problem solving, it's important to us that we dedicate our time to create long-lasting, sustainable change. And one of the ways we do that is by focusing on the root causes of issues rather than just trying to alleviate the symptoms. So for example, let's look at an issue, let's look at the problem of childhood obesity. Treating the symptoms of the problem, like diabetes and heart disease that come up because of the issue, they're important. It's important to treat these issues, to treat diabetes and heart disease, but it also doesn't prevent childhood obesity from occurring in the first place. It's much more sustainable to focus on the root causes of the issue, like food deserts and the lack of affordability of healthy foods, in order to prevent both the problem and the symptoms of the problem from occurring. If we look at it like a tree, picking at the symptoms or the leaves doesn't take care of the problem as a whole, whereas digging up the roots prevents the entire tree from growing in the first place. And so the way that we tackle these root issues is through three types of sustainable change: policy change, systems change, or environmental change. Policy change refers to legislation, such as a law that makes all public parks tobacco-free zones. System change refers to organizational changes, like requiring youth representation on a board of directors. And lastly, environmental change refers to changes in the physical environment, such as adding a grocery store to a food desert. And so when we look at changes that we want to make, we always try to address social determinants. And social determinants often are part of the root cause of an issue and are characteristics or situations that determine health outcomes, access to resources, etc. For example, education is a social determinant that can influence food choices, access to health services, and more, and disparities in education can lead some people to make poor eating choices and have less access to health care. Similarly, race, gender, income level, etc. can have an impact on these outcomes. Social determinants are connected, and oftentimes one social determinant, like education, can influence other social determinants, like socioeconomic status. We use policy, systems, and environmental changes as ways to combat these social determinants and get at the root causes of issues. So this leads to the question about how do we get there and how do we do this kind of work? And really there are three types of, quote, youth work that happen, and it's important to distinguish between them. Those three types are advocacy, service learning, and volunteerism. Of course, we'll go ahead and give the answer away and say that advocacy work is going to be the primary way to get to community-wide and long-lasting change. But I'm going to go ahead and explain a little bit more about all three types. So the first is volunteerism, and I'm sure that you can all think of an example of youth volunteering. Volunteerism essentially means donating time, energy, resources, etc. It's usually an isolated act, and examples include having a bake sale, food drive, or building houses with Habitat for Humanity. Well, this kind of work is definitely important and is sometimes the only thing that people can commit to. It doesn't really create any kind of sustainable change, especially because it usually only addresses the symptoms of an issue. And because these are isolated occurrences, they often aren't as sustainable as other strategies. While volunteerism is definitely important and often the only way people can help, it usually doesn't result in any long-term change. And so the second method is service learning. And this is like volunteerism in that it's usually an isolated event, but it also includes some component of education and or reflection, sometimes with a class or a grade. Examples of this can look like hosting a health fair, tutoring younger students, or doing community education. And it's especially important because of the learning aspect and can really help provide background information about an issue, but also doesn't really result in any long-term sustainable change. And so the last method, and the one that we like to focus on, is advocacy. We focus on this because we believe it has the most potential for long-lasting change. It can use situations of volunteerism and service learning, but takes it a step further by working towards focusing on long-term solutions. Oftentimes, these solutions address one of the root causes we talked about earlier, and therefore are much more sustainable. The immediate impact of advocacy work is usually not as tangible as volunteerism or service learning because changing policies, systems, and environments takes time. But overall, the size of the impact of successful advocacy is much larger. Advocacy can include engaging key stakeholders, lobbying, media outreach, etc., and usually results in a significant change within the community. I also think it's important to point out that in advocacy work, there's also a lot of individual growth that occurs within the youth and other people involved. In the same way that youth grow skills and a critical awareness through volunteerism and service learning work, they learn and apply new skills, but in doing so, tackle the root causes of community problems when doing advocacy. So what does this look like? Let's take a real-world example. Let's say that there's a park in a community, but no one really uses it because it's not safe. With volunteerism, a group of people might come out one Saturday and pick up the park. Like I said earlier, this would be an isolated incident, and although the immediate impact is pretty clear, after a few weeks the park will be dirty and unusable again. So with service learning, a similar event might occur. Perhaps a larger group of people would come out one day to pick up the park. More members of the community might be engaged, and some people would learn about the positive effects of gardening or planting flowers, etc. But after a few weeks, the park would again be dirty and unusable. So with advocacy, we might start with one isolated event, but at that event we could ask members of the community what they'd like to see change. Then we could do some more research and find out what the park policies are in other towns and combine all of the information to come up with a solution. Then we could present our findings and recommendations to the Parks and Recreation Board, eventually coming up with enough data and community support to pass our policy. Even though this process will likely take much longer than volunteering or service learning, as you can see, the number of people impacted and the sustainability of the change are both much greater.
And what does this look like? What are some examples? And thinking through how YES measures success. So up on the screen, we put on a couple bullets of instances of change that we've been a part of in the past. The top two are systems changes, finding a way for youth to be more embedded in organizational decision making. We think of organizations and events and ongoing processes as systems. The second two are environmental changes, examples of changing the physical environment to create access to needed resources, or changing the physical environment to make alcohol less accessible to youth. And then the final two policies are policy changes, but we do want to lift up that we wanted to put a little p policy change at the local level and the big P policy change when talking about state legislation, which of course is going to impact way more people. And this is going to get into our final part of the webinar, and it's talking about what impact means and how to measure outcomes. First and foremost, I definitely want to just share these next few slides to say that doing youth empowerment work is measurable and does have outcomes and can be tied to your return on investment. And as many of you know, I'm sure capturing your measurable change is critical to the success of your organization and is critical for advocating for your organization, for funding for your organization. And yes, we work with our partners to measure how many people are exposed to the model, and depending on the depth of that exposure, what happens as a result. So for introductory presentations or interactions, we'll take a head count of how many people listened in, but typically we won't follow up and ask any questions about deeper level interaction or what happened as a result. But in instances like a training, we'll follow up with we'll do an immediate evaluation to see if new skills were learned. We will follow up around 45 days and see if anything has happened since then. And then we will follow up 1 year later and see if anything has happened to create any form of policy system or environmental change. And just as a side note, we're actually test piloting and doing a 6-month follow-up this coming year. And what does this look like? What do outcomes look like as we have captured them? This slide is tied to the outcomes that we see within our individual youth staff. But similarly, we want to know how many youth have learned a new skill, are taking action, but also how many are impacting policy systems or environments. And then at the bottom, you can also see some other of the ancillary measures that we capture moving forward. And then when we train and interact with people outside of the organization, this is what our outcomes measures look like. So in the stoplight format, at first we do see how many people are exposed or interact with the youth empowerment model. And then of those, how many are trained? And then of those that were trained, how many learned a new skill and took action? And then at the very bottom, it's really important for us to know what changes occurred as a result of implementing the youth empowerment model within your work. And estimating on an impact number. Sometimes that's easy to find, sometimes it's not so easy to find.
So what do we want the takeaway to be here? First of all, youth empowerment is complex, and focuses more on root causes and sustainable change. It's not a program, but rather is a process and an outcome of your work. Secondly, youth empowerment is quantifiable, and the general trend has been extremely positive. Like we said earlier, 100% of Yes Youth staff have learned new skills and taken positive action, and 93% have impacted a policy, system, or environment. Additionally, retaining youth comes from effective recruitment strategies. Yes Youth remain employees for an average of 18 months, and many, including myself, continue to work with Yes after they graduate high school. And finally, the youth empowerment model is extremely effective in reaching outcomes. We've seen outstanding success in both youth and adults when exposed to the model, and more than half have taken some sort of action afterwards. The youth empowerment model is very effective.
Thanks, John. And so real quick, just 2 quick sum-up slides about the services that we do. Like we said earlier, youth and adult trainings, organizational assessments, consulting, resource creations, and webinars like this. And in addition to what's on the screen that I was originally planning on sending as a follow-up through Erica, I will also be sending the Youth HR toolkit. But I also encourage you to go onto our website and check out what free resources are there in addition. And like I said earlier, we'd love to stay in touch and to hear about the work that you're doing and any potential ways to partner. So let's jump back to Kathy's question. For instance, when working with obesity, would you benefit by input from youth without obesity issues? And if so, what is the benefit? So I'm going to give this to John.
Yeah, so I think it's very important to understand that youth know youth better than adults know youth. And so whenever you're doing any sort of youth empowerment work, it's always beneficial to have youth, whether they have that lived experience or not, because they're more in touch with they are the cohort that you're dealing with. And so just kind of an example from the work that we've done at Yes, we tackle different issues that affect young people, and even though not everyone who's part of the youth staff has a lived experience with that particular issue, they still can bring something to the table that the adult partners can't bring simply because they are part of that cohort.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well. I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn't, I don't want to say, but I think that it isn all value or no value. I think that there are it is a continuum of value. I think you are going to get a more direct reflection of the issues that you're working with a young person who is suffering from those problems. But I also think, like, in order to know what problems exist within a food desert, for example, you need to know what a food desert looks like and what an area that has ample supply of access to healthy foods looks like, in order to distinguish and address that problem. And I see a question from Annie. The question is, if youth are invited to be a part of a board or other governing body, is there also a need to have adults that understand things like cognitive development and working with youth, or do we treat youth voices the same way we treat adult voices, or both? I love this question, and I really appreciate it, because so often we have conversations with partners who want to jump into a youth training when, just as you said, there is a significant amount of development needed with the adults that surround the opportunity. You know, we've called it feathering the nest before, working with adults to create an equitable space that is welcoming, is safe, is comfortable for the youth once they come in. I think that it can be very detrimental to your success if the adults in the room are not prepared for what the expectations are once those youth come into the room. And so oftentimes we are working with our partners in training rooms of adults prior to doing any sort of youth training. And I'd say capacity building for adults is a critical piece for boards, for executive staff, for program staff, for anybody who's going to be working with youth. I think youth empowerment is a skill that needs development and ongoing capacity in the same way that other skills do. Great question. So maybe one more minute for any other questions, and if not, we'll turn it over to Erica to send us out.
Great, thank you, Parrish. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We do have about 2 minutes, so if someone wants to send in a final one, we'll get to it. And if not, I just want to thank you all for participating in the webinar today. At the conclusion of this webinar, you'll receive an email that will have an evaluation link in the email. And so if you could just please complete that, that would be fabulous. And I also, on the screen now, I have posted some upcoming events that we're having at the Foundation. On September 28th, we're going to have the Boast Memorial Health Policy Forum in Bowling Green. And October 29th, we're going to have a data forum in northern Kentucky in Erlanger. So please check those out on our website. And again, thank you very much, Parrish and Yana. I greatly appreciate your presentation today. And as soon as you get me those materials, I will get them out to the webinar participants. So check your email for those.
Thank you, Erica. It was great. And thanks, everybody, for listening in.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.